Hello and good morning friends, welcome to the CEC live lectures. Dear friends, we have very successfully completed a series on Indian writing in English, and now we have started with a new series on Indian writing in English translations. Dear friends, in a previous session also we have discussed on Indian writing in English translation. So taking the series forward, today we are going to talk on Indian writing method of approaches, and for this discussion we have once again with us in our studios Dr. Anand Prakash. Professor Prakash is a retired professor from Department of English, Delhi University. He has immense knowledge and his experience always helps us in discussing and enlightening ourselves with the approaches. So let's welcome our guest Professor Anand Prakash, and let's try to have a deep insight into the topic Indian writing methods of approaches. Dear friends, your calls are welcome in this session of ours, where you can ask questions from Professor Prakash. So dear friends, to contact us, to ask questions from Professor Prakash, you can contact us through our toll-free number. Our toll-free number is 1-800-110-430. This is our toll-free number through which you can ask questions, but in the last 10 minutes of the session. So let's begin with the lecture first, and definitely we will try to give answers to your questions. Hello sir, welcome to this lecture.
Thank you, Gitika, and welcome viewers. And today the topic of discussion is Indian writing methods of approach. And I found it necessary to discuss this particular aspect, which is theoretical in nature. You know, whenever we discuss something, whenever we approach a topic, whenever we are curious about a subject, then we use a method, sometimes unconsciously and sometimes consciously. And let's be conscious about this. When we discuss something new like Indian writing, and Indian writing is a huge subject. It starts, I think, very early in history, so early in fact that we can't specify not just the year but also the decade or the century. And if our text was composed so many years ago, so many centuries ago, millennia ago, and it was not at that point of time printed in form, but passed on from generation to generation through legend. In that case, it becomes really difficult to in fact get the authenticity of the text and the author. One doesn't know who the author was most of the time, so far as the ancient texts are concerned, because the text has passed on, and in the process of being passed on, many things have been added and certain things have been removed also from it, because it belongs to the oral tradition. So how to approach this kind of a text, this kind of a literature? And when I say this kind, when I say the category under which such a thing emerges, then I'm conscious that the very authenticity, as I said, plus the information available about the text or about the folklore, about the legend, is something that we have to be concerned about. And how do we then make sense of such a text if we do not know all these things? And even if we did, then we have to pick up certain strategies, certain methods to understand this text, to grasp its meaning, to at least guess the meaning that is embedded in it, and then in our own way articulate it in such a manner that this is made available to viewers like you, who are alert and who would like to ask questions, who would like to disagree with me, and you would give me also a chance to disagree with what I say, because one cannot be sure about a body of this size and nature. So I thought that before we go into the specific areas of texts or authors, let's share with one another the method that we'll be using in order to understand such a literature. So when I say method, then I'll be saying that it's not just one method. In the realm of knowledge, and particularly when the knowledge concerns literature, There can't be the method or a specific method. It has to be methods. That's why the topic of discussion today is methods of approach. So there are different methods, and in any case, scholars always have their own method, and because there are innumerable scholars, so they will have their own individual way to approach a particular subject. So how to approach this subject is the query that I make, and I share this with you, that there is no standard method. We have to evolve a method ourselves, maybe through discussion, through talking about certain things, doing some guesswork, imagining things, then explaining those imagined things, and then going further through this. In this course, maybe we evolve an understanding of the text or the author that we have in mind. So the first thing itself is theoretical. There cannot be a method. There have to be methods. As many methods as there are people, as many methods as there are generations of people, people belonging to even the viewership like you. You would like a certain method to be adopted and not another method, and because you are innumerable in number, in size, therefore you would be expecting that we should discuss this thing in some detail. Now, one standard method accepted all over is the historical method. You always go to history, always go to the past, you always go to the associations that are there with respect to an author or an epoch, and these associations are taken care of. They are specified, they are explained, and through the explanation and specification of the associations, we come to terms with the meaning of a particular author or a text. So we go into history. Suppose a book was supposed to be composed. The book was composed, let's say, in the 300 BC. Then we have to go to the history of it. And since the history is not exactly known, and there are no sources available of the kind that we could be comfortable with, therefore, the method of history may succeed, it may not succeed, but the method of history is there. Suppose the text belonged to the medieval period or to the modern period, and even in the modern period to the 18th century, 19th century, 20th centuries, then easily we could say, well, these were the political conditions, these were the social conditions, these were the ideological issues that the generations around the author grappled with. Then it's easy to come upon and zero in on the meaning that is embedded in the text. So history is a very important method. But what do we do when the text is 2,000 years old or 3,000 years old? In such a case, we have to adopt the historical method, but more than the historical method also. We, for instance, know that 3,000 years ago, India had a large chunk of villages which were not connected with one another as organically as they came to be later, and they had their wholesome way of approaching nature and their surroundings. So if we visualize this and then come upon the text, then maybe we can make some idea of what the text has to communicate to us. So the historical method that way is important. If we don't have the historical method, if we straight away go to the text, then it's a jumble of words. These words say something to us, but then they may not say the thing that the author might have intended, or the thing that was found relevant by his viewers, his audience at that point of time. So that thing is to be kept in mind, and historical method is established, but at the same time, historical method has to be understood in a specific manner. So the first thing is that we refer to the time in which the text was composed. The second method can be, and viewers, you can always compare the two methods or more methods that I'll come to, but let me first explain to you the second method, and keep in mind that it may not be exactly appealing or exactly useful. The second method is the humanist voice, clearly visible or hidden in the text. Now there are many things. Humanist voice, what is humanist voice? I think something that is of concern to us. We are human beings, there were human beings at that time also. Those human beings were confronted with certain questions, and they tried to sort out those questions and find answers to them at that time. And the human in us we are all members of a society and we behave as human beings, and we are moved by, touched by certain meanings that are there in the text which belong to the old era. So in that case, we very clearly identify ourselves with those human beings who wrote the text then. And because we relate ourselves so well, therefore, we would say, okay, this is what the person is saying in terms of human experience. So we are human beings, they were human beings, they had their experiences. Those experiences we can understand today. Why? How do we understand them today? Because we can visualize that in those conditions, human beings would behave like this. So there are humanist voices there in a text. And voices, the humanist voice is exactly at that point of time is the voice of the author. So the author is interpreting the world around him in terms, that appeal to him and appeal to him as a human being. So humanism that way connects us with authors and texts of different periods in the past. And then I say clearly visible or hidden. The humanist voice is not all the time clear. It is clearly visible in some cases. In some other cases, it's not very clear, because maybe the words used are vague words. The words used are deeply concerned about the text, and the text is talking in 2 or 3 voices. Maybe there are characters. Maybe the author has changed one's stand in such a manner that he or she at that point of time, it's mostly males then, at that point of time would express an idea and still be somewhat doubtful about it. So the humanist voice will in that case be somewhat submerged. But we as alert readers today would like to see as to why the author, while saying such a thing, fumbled. Why did the author remain vague? And when we address this question, then we realize that maybe in those conditions we also would have fumbled. We also would have remained vague. We also may not have understood fully the import of what we are saying. So humanist voice in those texts is hidden sometimes and sometimes it is clear, and our job is to seek clarity if it is hidden, and if it is clear, then we have to look at its nature and we have to assess its worth and value for us today. So the second method, the first method was the historical method, when we go to the background of the text and the author. The second method is we locate, we find out and identify the voice of the human in writing, and that voice of the human is important for relating to that text that was composed so many years ago. The third method that we can use for our own benefit while reading Indian literature, which is the subject today, the third method would be of going to the biography of the author. This is how the author behaved in one's life. This is when the author was born. This is the family to which the author belonged. Such were the parents, such were the teachers, such were the surroundings. All these things, if we have the resources to find out the biographical details of an author, which is there in the case of, let's say, late medieval and the early modern or the contemporary period, where details about life, about biography of an author are more or less clearly available, and these shed some light on the text, on the words that are used by the author in order to present a certain experience. And so biography is important. But sometimes you would see, I'm just being critical about all these approaches, all these methods that I'm sharing with you for understanding their relevance. So the difficulty about the biographical approach is that here the author is giving us help to understand what he wants to say. But what he wants to say is not exactly related to his own life. Maybe he is concerned about something else. Maybe he is concerned about another area. Maybe he himself is a researcher and he wants to tell us about all those things. And if the author is a researcher, if the author wants to understand another area of consciousness, another area of geography, another area in time, in that case, the author is not putting his own personal experience there. So why is biographical approach in that case useful? So this is the question I raise. and you also think about it as to how far biography is going to be useful to understand a particular literary work. But this is the method, and in many cases this can be useful, in other cases it may not be useful. So what I say is that this third method of biography also can be used if details are available, but at the same time we have to be conscious that these details may not have a direct bearing on, a direct relationship with what the author has written. So the third is the biographical method of approach. The fourth is a tradition-bound outlook rooted not just in the time to which the work belonged, but inherited from all mythical sources. This is, I think, the most relevant thing so far as our course material that we are sharing with you is concerned. Most of the Indian life is bound by tradition, and this tradition is not easily definable. You know what tradition is, that there can be a particular way of living at a time, and when that time passes and a new generation approaches, then the family, the father, the mother, the elders in the community, the villages and the people living there, they tell the child when the child was born that this is correct. So there is no reason to believe or disbelieve regarding what is told to the child when he is in the process of growing up. So a child is 5 years, a child is 10 years, then he moves towards adulthood. The person is 20 years, 30 years, and his mental makeup in the meantime has been determined by what he has heard from his childhood. And people who told him, they themselves may not be exactly aware of what they were saying. They also had heard from somebody else. So which means that over a period of time, let's say over a period of 50 years or 100 years, 4 or 5 generations came, and those generations passed on the idea of tradition from one to the other. In that case, the tradition kept on being presented in that form, and there was no authenticity. Nobody could say for certain whether new ideas in the meantime had come or not, or if they came, were they accepted or rejected. Therefore, what is uppermost in the mind of the person who listens to and who hears the views of others is that this is how people talk and this is how they have to be accepted. This is called tradition. And in India, this tradition is very important, and it's the most accepted form of gaining knowledge. And how far this tradition is acceptable or not acceptable is not asked. We don't even put questions before tradition, wrongly or rightly. I don't want to go into that question. But then tradition is a very important component of knowledge in the Indian conditions. And if it is that important, then the author who also grew up in one's specific circumstances also would have come to understand and accept this traditional view. So our job then, as scholars today, is to understand this tradition. So history is important, but not that important. Humanist voice one can do without. Biography also can be put on one side. And we can say, this is the fourth method, we can say that Indian tradition is like this. And because we have always adhered to this tradition, therefore, we find it quite useful for us. So let's stick to it. And if we hold this view of being all the time accepting the tradition, then we will have the traditional meaning. And you know that in Indian writing of the old period or the medieval period, this tradition would be a kind of a lesson that we learn from literature. In fact, you would have heard this light-hearted thing in your daily parlance. And the thing is, what does this story teach us? What does this poem teach us? How is it meaningful? What is the use of this? And the use value is always there in the story. As the teacher always tells you, okay, now I'll tell you something good, and the teacher says, that's how it is good. And the teacher has been telling this to a large number of students, and those students later on become teachers themselves, and they tell the same thing again and again, which means literature becomes a kind of education where the elders tell the younger people as to what is right and what is wrong. So this is the method of understanding tradition and passing it on to somebody else. And there might have been tradition, let's say 500 years ago. That tradition finally disappeared. How it disappeared is not to be discussed today. But then We know that 500 years ago an author wrote something and he was bound by this tradition, by this traditional outlook. So let's study the tradition. So we can study a tradition that existed in our society 1,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago, 2,000 years ago, or 200 years ago. And if you keep on studying these traditions, then you will have a fairly good view, a fairly substantial view of the literature that is composed in the Indian conditions. So the tradition-bound literature, but there is a problem with this, and the tradition and the problem is that since the source of the tradition is not known clearly in the identifiable sense, therefore, and because different people are interpreting tradition in their own manner, so maybe 2 or 3 people interpret tradition in different manner, and there can be then variance, various responses, fixed in the tradition. And sometimes those new different responses also create a problem for us, a kind of a hurdle for us. We just do not know which aspect of the tradition that is made available to us is more acceptable or less acceptable than another. Therefore, we start discussing tradition, and since the tradition doesn't have a source, so we generally go by what we hear. What I tell you, you accept. What you tell your friends, that's what they accept. And in the process of telling, if some difference occurs, then that difference is generally pushed under the carpet. Nobody bothers to discuss that difference. But our job as scholars today, as modern scholars, is to go into different versions of the tradition, told by different people, made by different people, and then ask ourselves the question as to how these different versions exist and what caused them. So that becomes a point of entry into an area which is the area of knowledge, and this is how through discussion we can learn a lot. So the fourth method that we can think of to understand Indian literature is to study the tradition that surrounded, that impacted, that influenced the mind of the author or the composer of literature. And since there is no identifiable method, therefore it becomes a myth sometimes. We start imagining that this is what would have happened, and if we start imagining, then you don't even bother about the person who explained the tradition to you. The person himself may not know as to where the tradition came from, and the person who told also may have lost a complete connection with the source of the thing. So therefore we start imagining that there were gods, that there were mountains which talked, there were animals which talked, and that these animals finally came to be associated with the powers of nature. And then that power of nature can loom large in our mind, in our imagination, and then we say, okay, this is the myth, this is what we believe in. And I can give the example of certain tribes in India, and these tribes believe quite clearly that they believe that their association is with a bird, is with an animal, is with a god. And these things, because they are mythical, nobody has, seen them with open eyes and all. And some people might say that they have seen them. So there's no way as to find out whether it was actually seen or not seen, but then it is believed to be there. And if it is believed to be there and cannot be identified with eyes or with certain other methods of understanding, therefore we say it's a myth. And well, if there are people who talk about a myth today and talk about a myth 50 years later, and the people have changed in the meantime who were talking, therefore all of them added something to the explanation of the myth, and they also took away certain other things from the myth. So the myth keeps growing, and the mythical things are such, you can't really tell where exactly they go against or go away from the real situation that we see before us. So these are the mythical sources. Our job then, in such a case, in this fourth method, is to somehow locate the nature of tradition and the nature of the myth. So the nature of myth is very important to understand, and if we understand this, then of course we can see new meanings in the same text that earlier we were getting only a superficial view from. The broadly fifth and the last method that I can think of is the textual linguistic interpretation. You have a text in front of you, and this text begins with a certain sentence, it ends with a certain sentence, there is something in the middle, there are phases of growth, of going up, the text goes up, presents a problem to us, engages us with that problem, and stirs us, moves us, inspires us, and we set thinking regarding it. So which means that we totally get immersed in the text which is in front of us. And towards the end, we know that now the text is coming to an end. Therefore, let's start putting a kind of order upon the words, instances and situations in the text. And that way, we come to the conclusion that this is how things ended, this is how they would have ended, this is how they should have ended, this is how they should not have ended. So all those things are there at the end, but then the text, because has finally come to a stop, therefore you focus upon the text and some kind of understanding will be gained by that focus. So this is a method. The method is, do not go to the historical sources, do not go to tradition, do not go to the biography, just focus upon the text that is there in front of you today as printed on the page. Then the linguistic interpretation. What is text? Text is words for us. Well, once again, I don't want to go into the theory of it. Text can be something else. It may not be just words. It might be gestures. It might be text might be in the form of a play. Text might be in the form of a song. There's a kind of musicality about words. So I'm not going into that. But then, language is an important part of a text. Whether it is the language is written or the language has been spoken, the language has been, the words in the text have been sung, have been set to music. Whatever the case, the words are there. And these words have to be seen in their interconnection with other words. So this is an approach that you read a text, you take help from others to understand the text. For instance, I can ask you, if you are sitting next to me, that this is what I understand by this word, but what is your way of interpreting this word? And you can give your input, and then I say, okay, maybe I didn't get it that way, but you're right. And there's a third person, then I ask him or her also, what do you understand by this word? And he or she will say, okay, this is what I understand. So what are all the three of us doing? We are grappling with the nature of the words, which are language. And this way, I think this is the modern method. When I taught in a class, when I teach in a class, when I am face to face with a large number of scholars, then and students who want to learn things, then all of us are actually discussing words. So these words are there also in the text, and if these words are there in the text, then one can see that the language is finally becoming quite important. So viewers, let me go over it briefly again, because I'm coming to the end of this particular part of the lecture, and I would say that all these methods that I suggest are only of an abstract nature, and sometimes they overlap. Sometimes we mix two methods, we mix three methods, we can in fact mix all the methods, and then we start understanding the text better than otherwise. And these methods, our job today in this lecture is to understand which methods we can use in order to read a text, but then you should be aware that there is a method always in the reading of literature, and we are not conscious of it. We think that literature is there and we understand it, but then in doing so, we are adopting a method, we are electing a method, we are choosing a method, and we should actually be conscious about the nature of this method, whether this method is wrong, is right, is inadequate, is not able to help as much as it should, whether the method is approximate or whether it's actually there. All these questions we have to ask from not just the text in front of us, but from ourselves, our own selves. I can ask myself, I use this method, am I right or wrong? Should I not change this method and take another method? Should I not take help from another person to find out a better method than this? So all these questions emerge when you approach a body of literature from a country like ours. So I finished the first part of the discussion by telling you that these different methods are directly or indirectly considered by almost all the speakers, all the scholars, and if they're conscious about what they are doing, what they are using as method, then of course the study of literature will be further enhanced. Thank you. Welcome back to the second part of the lecture, and in this part we will be taking the discussion forward from the theoretical nature of the approaches that we have so far discussed, and we will take help from certain scholars who have used one method or the other and who have gone into the very nature of the methods that are adopted by us. For instance, when I thought of bringing this lecture to my own way of interpretation, then I realized that I have to see other people, other scholars, as to how they approach their material, the material that is in front of them. And I consulted a few texts, and then I was struck by statements of certain scholars. And since Indian literature is being covered under this series from the ancient period to the modern period, so I thought I should seek help from those scholars who deal with history, and history means incidents of the past, people of the past, traditions of the past, epochs of the past, problems of the past. All these things are important for a historian. Today's historian is not the historian only about writing about kings and queens and how long they lasted, but they go into the social conditions, they go into the ideas, into the views of people, their experiences. And today's history is totally different from the history that was written, let's say, 100 years ago. And there is a whole discipline in history these days, and the discipline also percolates to literature, law, philosophy. And that is that, there is a kind of approach that is important, and who is better equipped to talk about the approach to literature or to experience or to life than a historian. So I thought I should pick up two important historians from our times and ask them through their books as to what method they adopt in order to understand the experiences of life in the past. So when I was doing this, when I was shuffling pages of 2 or 3 books, then I was struck by certain ideas that had been put across by historians of our time. So one historian that I picked up for this, and this person belongs to the ancient India, and this person has been known as a great scholar of history. I refer to Professor Romila Thapar, and she has done work on Indian history, Indian traditions, Indian ways of governing, Indian ways of understanding in the ancient period. So I thought I should, for my own benefit, see as to what she has to say regarding the question of approach. And one very important thing that she did, that she said on the first page of the book is called History and Beyond. It is published by Oxford University Press, India. I just started reading it, and the statement of purpose in the beginning, that itself was striking, and I thought I should share that statement with you. I should try to consider the implications of the statement with you, share them with you, and through that I should be able to become clear about what exactly is to be done with respect to a particular historical material. Very interesting, because this kind of a thing is not easily said by a person, and this is what she says. What is ancient India? A question that we should always ask ourselves. Ancient India is what was supposed to be there 2000 years ago, 3000 years ago. The society was at that time different. Well, did this question ever get asked by a scholar, let's say in the 16th century, in the 15th century? There's no evidence that people would ask such a question at that time. What conditions were there then? We ask this question today. Why do we ask this question? Why not a 15th century person? You go to the poets, you go to the scholars of that time, if there is some evidence is available. In Europe it is available. In India also it might be available in some form or the other. We can go to a medieval poet and we can see as to how this poet is approaching one's own life, one's own subject. So we will find that what was written earlier may not have been as much important for them as it is important for us. It's a fact. It's a fact that today we want to know about ancient India. But did the medieval person also talk about the ancient India the way we talk? I don't think so. And then Romila Thapar makes this particular observation in this respect. She says, both the colonial experience and nationalism of recent centuries. These two important things. Colonial experience. What is the colonial experience? We were a colony of the British. And this colonial experience with us started in the late 18th century. In the 19th century, we became totally enslaved by the colonial system of governance that was there under the rule of the Britishers. They in the 19th century made us a colonized country, made us into a kind of colony. And this colony started oppressing us. And we became pained. We were pained by this. Nobody wants to be a slave. We also didn't want to be a slave. But we were at that time subjected to the conditions that were of enslavement. We were told again and again in the 19th century by the Britishers that we were inferior. In outlook, we were inferior in understanding, we were inferior in qualities to them, and therefore they had to govern us and we had to be governed by them. We had to accept them as our rulers. Now this is called colonial experience, and this colonial experience is humanistically speaking is a very weakening experience. Nobody wants to be called a slave or wants to become a slave. So this pain, this particular suffering, this particular distress that we underwent in the 19th century, this may have compelled us to think whether there was some time in the past, like in the 19th century, the past would be 15th century, 16th century, when the colony was not there and when we were different. So actually we become aware about the history in the 19th century. Before that we don't think about the past. So maybe this is what this historian is telling us. The colonial experience and nationalism of recent centuries. What is nationalism? Something that rejects colonialism, that works against colonialism. If I am a nationalist, if I am proud of being Indian, if I am proud of being an important citizen of my own country, then of course I will shed the colonial experience. I will fight against it. So in both the cases, when I am a slave, then I am pained and anguished. When I am a nationalist, then I am more than pained, more than anguished. I become a protester. I want to protest. I become angry. So this anger and this pain, they may have compelled us to go back to the past. Viewers, I hope you understand. I also hope that is acceptable, because when you are pained, then you think. When you are fighting, then you think. And what do you think? You think of a time when you are not a slave. You think of a time when you are free. You think of a time when your view and that of your country were one. So this is what nationalism is. So national experience of the 19th century, colonial experience of the 19th century, this compelled people to go to the past. these two particular segments of experience in the 19th century, they would compel us to know how great we were earlier. So therefore, we go back to the ancient period through these two experiences. This is what Thapar is saying, that the colonial experience and nationalism of recent centuries, the last 2 or 3 centuries, influenced the study, particularly of the early period of history. So if these things had not been here, then you would not have understood. This may be true about us. This may not be true about other countries. Maybe they didn't have the colonial experience, maybe they didn't have the national experience, and their queries were different. But anyway, we are talking about ourselves. I think we understand history. We start understanding history, raising questions about it only in the 19th century. Before that, we do not grapple with this question. This is what she is saying, and I think that this is quite relevant. But she is a historian, and as a historian, she will go back to the past now, and she will then try to understand. So that method which we discussed in the first part of the discussion, first part of our lecture, that was that history is important. So what Thapar is saying is history is important, but history becomes important when you start asking questions caused by distress, caused by pain, caused by the spirit to fight. So ancient India is the gift of the 19th century thought to us, gift of the 19th century experience to us, and we become conscious about our greatness, conscious about the changing life in our midst only in the 19th century. So 19th century has produced the ancient Indian history. This is what she is saying. Well, viewers, you may agree with me, you may agree with Thapar, you may disagree with me, you may disagree with Thapar, but then there are certain conditions which compel us to think differently and more than at other times. And therefore, history is important. It's a lively subject, it's a living subject, it's a dynamic subject, and in a way, Thapar is saying that bring in history, bring in examination, bring in facts, and on the basis of those facts, you start understanding literature. So when I discuss Mahabharata, when I discuss Ramayana, when I discuss the poems of Kabir, when I discuss the plays written by Kalidas, how should I discuss? Which question should I raise? And historians tell us that, okay, you go back to the past and you say that these are important things and that these have remained important for a long time because they were valuable. So we have that kind of a valuable literature with us. I think this understanding of patriotism, this understanding of pain that we have undergone in the 19th century, this has equipped us with knowledge that will make us proud of our past, make us more intelligent about in our own life on the basis of our knowledge of the past. The purpose is not to be arrogant. The purpose is not to be assertive. It's not to tell others that we are superior. The purpose is to understand our worth and meaning at a time when we are free, and that we will always work for this kind of freedom. Nationalism is a subject that we discussed today in different terms, but in the terms in which it is presented here, I think it's a valuable thing for us that in ancient India we were composing literature to our own liking. I'm not going into sections of society that at that time may have been distressed, that may have been suppressed at that time. I'm not going into that question, but I am saying that India, the great country, the subcontinent where different cultures were evolved and they coexisted with one another, where they learned from one another, this country of diversity is to be understood in its true nature, and that understanding can be enriched by our knowledge of the literature that was produced in the past. For instance, not that I have to today share with you the view of literature produced earlier, but let me tell you that when you read a play composed in the ancient period, then you realize that there are characters on the stage who speak to one another, and they speak in different ways to one another. Somebody protests, somebody else disagrees, a third person agrees, a fourth person sings and celebrates. So all these 4 or 5 experiences that are presented on the stage in the play, what do they signify? They signify not just one approach, they signify 4 or 5 approaches, and all the people on the stage are peacefully coexisting with one another, or if they are fighting, then they are shown as fighting. So in either case, what is seen is that this society is a living society where people differ, they disagree, they fight, and yet they remain together on the stage. So just see that literature has a different way of being interpreted when it is placed against this kind of an idea that there was a time when people freely interacted with one another, when people watched also the plays and they enjoyed them. So enjoying a play, watching a play, seeing people fight, disagree, and celebrating, all this shows that society of the ancient period was a different ball game. It was a different kind of society, a society that believed in celebrating, a society that believed in bravely behaving, courageously behaving, fearlessly talking. So that tradition was there, and that when they differed, they also differed with a sense of freedom. So these questions that I am raising today regarding writing of the ancient or the medieval period are based in the distress and the pride of the 19th century life. And that's quite important, and we have the historians' support for us, and we see that when we see something, then there are two things. One, that there is a thing in front, and secondly, that we are seeing. So both are important. When I see a spectacle in front of me, then I can see that spectacle, that particular scene in its own nature, in its own dynamism. At the same time, I can become aware that I am seeing it, and that I have this dynamism in myself. That's why I am putting my value there. So just see that reading of literature, reading of history, anything that is connected with knowledge is something that is always two ways, if not still more complex, and that this complexity is the fun of knowing, is the fun of gaining knowledge, is the fun of distributing ideas, making ideas available, and that the whole thing regarding knowledge, the whole thing regarding literature, the whole thing regarding understanding life is a matter of enjoyment. So this is the first point I thought I should make, and there is another point by the same scholar, and I'll just read out this quotation and then I'll go into its implications. The concept of history as evolving. Does history change? Does it evolve? Does it become better than before? What is your view? Does history, does life, does experience become better than before? Think about it and get back to this discussion in your imagination. And this is what Thapar says. Historical consciousness in early India took a form which grew out of embedded history. There were two kinds of history then, the embedded history and the inherited history. The embedded history which was there, it was not moving very much, it was already there. For instance, the old scriptures, the old texts, there was knowledge inside them. Nobody knew whether the knowledge was in the form of change, or in the form of changed circumstance, or that the universe had been captured in such a manner that it appeared to be eternal. Nobody knew about it, but this was there as history. Like 5,000 years ago, there are no sources to tell us what changes occurred, or 10,000 years ago. Maybe those languages are not available to us at that point of time in the form in which they might have existed. There would have been a language, that language required some kind of preservation. That preservation is not there. Maybe if you say that it's there in 10,000 years ago, I can go further, 15,000 years ago. So what I mean is that in the ancient period, the knowledge is embedded, history is embedded, it is there as fixed in a particular manner. So early India took a form which grew out of embedded history. The form grows out of embedded history, that history becomes a background, where Kshatriya legitimation became necessary. In history, people who fight, people who are brave, people who subdue others, these people can also govern better, because they subdue, and then that power can be used in order to keep a check on, is to discipline other people who are of anarchic nature. So Kshatriya kind of control over society in the ancient period. This became necessary, says the historian. The Itihas Puran tradition was strengthened with a drawing upon embedded history for origins. Where did we come from? This is called origins. Our origins lie somewhere in nature, so somewhere in the life around time then in those moments. So Itihas Puran is that. Nobody knows what actually existed, but then there is a background to it, and that background is known. This is how different elements came together. This is how history was formed. Nobody knows how it happened, but then there is some kind of a verse, there is some kind of a description saying this. So it is strengthened with a drawing upon embedded history for origins, and then comes Vanshawali, says she. Vanshawali, there is the first king, there is the second king, there is the third king, all of them belong to the same family, and this family runs for, let's say, 200 years, and the whole Vanshawali is then put into words, is put into the information mode, and that is what history initially is. And is distinguished from the embedded section and is therefore a break from the past. The Vanshawali is a movement forward. There is embedded history when you just know that things existed, to some time when Kshatriyas come to rule the country, to rule the society, and then they say, this person is the king. Then you say, this person is the prince. That prince will become a king after the king is dead. And then the prince will become a king, and this will continue for, let's say, 200 or 300 years. And then, there might be assertion from elsewhere, from another part of the country, and a different family comes. Now, when families come to rule, as happened in the ancient India, at that point of time, you can say that movement is happening. So, in embedded history, movements don't happen. But then, when families come, then things start moving, and this movement is quite strong and quite visible in the ancient period. And it's therefore a break from the past and takes the form of historical consciousness expressed as externalized history. So Vanshas, families, dynasties, these are actually externalized history. History has moved from its original source of embeddedness into the domain of time, of the modern time. What is Thapar saying here? And this is directly relevant to what we are going to discuss in the context of literature. Literature also is a part of it. Literature is experience. History is experience. History may be a controlled experience of society under a certain dynasty. That's what history is. But this dynasty also ensures that people can enjoy. And when they enjoy, then they require some singers, they enjoy some writers. And those writers and singers, under the rule of the Kshatriyas, then they create literature. So it is important that literature is understood in its context of governance by a certain section of people. And that way you can say that there is an element of time, there is an element of change in the entire structure that I am talking about. Now I take help from, towards the end of the discussion, I take help from another historian, and this time it's not just the ancient India historian, but a historian in the general sense of the term, and this person is A.L. Basham. It's a foreign scholar, it's an Australian scholar, a historian, and he has attempted a number of books on Indian history. What does he say about India and about the Indian life and about its nature? This is what he says. There is no reason, he says, to believe that the rate of change in India in earlier periods was any slower than that of other parts of the world. Now, there is a view about us, about our literature and about our history. The view is that change occurred here slower than elsewhere. In Europe, change occurred faster. Here it was slow. This person is saying, from his knowledge of history, that this is not the case. In India, the change occurred. Elsewhere in Europe, in the other parts of the world also, the change occurred. And in India, the change occurred at the same pace, at the same speed at which it was occurring elsewhere. So all ancient societies, India included, were societies that were informed by, that were influenced by change. And this change is to be studied as to how things changed. And he says quite clearly that India was a part of the world, an organic part of the world, and that it was like any other country at that point of time. It could not be called worse, it could not be called weaker, it could not be called distorted, because at that point of time India was a free country like all countries in the world, and there were conditions and their similarity that should not be missed by us. It was only from the 16th century onwards, says Basham, when a combination of many factors led to increasingly rapid technological and scientific advances. 16th century, 17th century, in Europe you see scientific advances occur faster than here. Mughal period is very strong in India, and at that point of time they are trying to keep pace with the advances, but they don't go much beyond a point. So then scientific advances are happening in Europe, and they are not happening at the same speed here. It is only then that the myth of changelessness of Asia begins to appear. India at that point of time, or Asia at that point of time, appears slower than other countries. And even then A.L. Basham, this great historian, says it's a myth. Not that actually India was slower, but the myth of India being slower, this starts only in the 16th century. Before that, India is a normal country like any other country in the world, if not better. And maybe India was better at that point of time than other countries. So the point I am making, and now I am coming to the close of the discussion, the point I am making is that literature has to be seen in the context of those methods which will help us understand its reality. And one parameter of reality is the actual parameter of history. So let's, in fact, I'll take a cue from here to project this view that ancient literature or medieval literature actually is a part of history. You may not agree. Many people wouldn't agree with this, that literature is history. But I am telling you that anybody who thought about a certain question in a specific manner in the medieval period will give us some view of the medieval period today. I can understand medieval period better if I understand the poetry of Kabir, for instance, or of Mirabai. Then I understand the relation between men and women. Then I understand the relation between patriarchy and citizens. And if I understand through literature the way in which patriarchy functioned, or religions functioned, or ideas functioned, then of course I am becoming enriched in terms of knowledge of history. So how is the literature of the ancient period not history, is the question. And my answer is that literature in one respect is a source of historical knowledge, and the source is not from facts, the source is from the experiences that got crystallized in a text at that time in the hands of writers and authors. So viewers, first talking about different methods of approach, and in the second part are taking help from certain scholars about about life in the ancient or the medieval period. I come to the conclusion that these methods will help us understand literature better, and secondly, that literature itself is so important, so real, so crystallized, so very concrete, that it can in fact be put on the side of, or put beside the matters that generally are supposed to be facts, that are supposed to be resources that help us understand the world better. So I conclude by saying that there can be not just a method, just one method. Let's be clear about it. In the classroom or in the assembly or when I talk to you or you to talk to others, there can't be just one method. There have to be different methods, and these methods have to assert themselves only vis-a-vis others, which means all methods are supposed to work together in a manner that they agree or disagree. They are found wanting or they are found better. Whatever the case, we should keep on discussing these things from our own point of view, and then we add to one another's knowledge through this. So I say through this that this kind of an approach is democratic. This kind of approach is egalitarian. It takes help from everybody, not that somebody is superior and another person is inferior, or that somebody doesn't know anything and I know everything. That's not the case. In fact, literature by itself is very democratic. Knowledge is very democratic, and so are we supposed to be all the time telling others and learning from others. So with these words, I come to the end of this lecture, and I hope you have enjoyed the lecture, and maybe you will be asking questions, if not today, some other day from us. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us a productive session once again. And dear friends, as Professor Prakash himself said, that if you have some set of questions, and you feel that the questions are not being answered today, so you have chance to ask question the number of times you wanted, because we would be coming in our future sessions where we would be discussing on another topics under the series Indian Writing in English Translation. There you can definitely ask a question live, or you can just post your questions at info.cec@nic.in. This is our email ID through which you can contact us, through which you can ask your questions. So dear friends, we would be meeting again very soon and would be discussing on another topic. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir. Thank you once again.
Thank you.